We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Planet Holyrood, the number one podcast on Scottish politics, recorded here at the Daily Record HQ in Glasgow. I'm Chris McCall. I'm the Deputy Political Editor at the Record, and I'm standing in for Paul Hutchin this week while he's busy chasing down some important stories in the capital. Joining me for our weekly powwow on Scottish politics are Mark Smith, the head of news at the Daily Record, and Douglas Dickie, content editor at the Scottish Daily Express. Now, we'll speak about Rachel Reeves and her extremely gloomy pre-budget speech in a little while. But first, I wanted to talk a bit about the late Alex Salmond, and in particular, the story that's been reported widely this week on the state of his personal finances at the time of his very sudden death last year. Just to briefly remind listeners, this story centres on the fact that Salmond died virtually penniless after trying to defend his reputation in 2 court cases. And lawyers winding up the estate of the former First Minister confirmed this week they're currently in a legal process, which is the equivalent of declaring his estate bankrupt. And that obviously came after he contested 2 court hearings over the course of 18 months beginning in 2018. Now, sources claim, quote, he lost almost all of his income from directorships and speaker engagements as a result of his determination to fight the cases and restore his reputation. Dougie, I'll come to you in a moment, but can I ask you first, Mark, what did you make of this story in general? And also, what do you think the public makes of it? Do you think there's a lot of sympathy for the position that Alex Salmond found himself in?
First things first, because it's Alex Salmond, it's box office.
Yep.
And he remains a towering figure in Scottish political discourse. And will do many generations to come. So first things first, anything relating to Alex Salmond is clearly a story. I'll say this, there's 2 things I know about Alex Salmond. A, he liked a flat, and B, he was a wily old fox when it came to his finances. I think, and it's not like me to say this because I'm a news editor, I think the story's over-egged slightly.
Okay.
I think Salmond probably done a good job of taking his asset base below the threshold for inheritance tax, and I think in doing so, he's probably done a great favour to his family, and I think that was probably in his mind, long before his sad demise. So, in the second point, I think I'd like to make is, as our colleague Paul Hutchin demonstrated, he was not living a life of penury.
No,
he was living a life of some. And he'd spent a lifetime in politics, spent a lifetime in media. He was getting a lot of his Russia Today work was earning him a fair wedge, more than I earn.
30 grand per episode.
Well, that's roughly about what I get for this, isn't it? About the same.
Roughly. 30 something. I think the last grand.
Yes. So I get a biscuit sometimes, although there's no biscuits today. So yes, I think it's I think it's been over-egged. And I think if there's anything we know about Alex, he's probably sorted it for himself and his family, and that's probably been. And I think he was probably living quite a fruitful life before his end.
Now, you alluded to some details there, Mark. This was a story that was in Tuesday's Daily Record online on Monday, and our colleague Paul Hutchin sadly can't be here today, but he first revealed that until relatively late in his life, that Salmond had been paying £7 grand a month to live in a £2.5 million luxury apartment overlooking Big Ben. And just to give you some further detail, that pad included access to a swimming pool, sauna, and even a bowling alley. And a source close to Salmond described it as being in a world-class apartment block. Dougie, is this the sort of place that you stay in? And
I wish. A typical Scottish nationalist. It seems he hates Britain, but loves London. Loves living the high life in London. I've got to be. I'm actually glad you said you thought it was over-egged, Smitty, because I think it's been over-egged a bit as well, if I'm being honest. And the story in today's Times, the front page of today's Times, I thought really kind of clutching a bit.
So concerning Salmond's widow, Moira.
So Moira might need to sell the house if this happens, and if this happens, and perhaps if this had happened before. There's an awful lot of ifs and buts in there, and I'm a wee bit uncomfortable with the way Moira Salmond seems to be presented as this kind of hopeless widow, this kind of someone who almost like people are saying she can't take care of herself. It feels a bit like that at times. I don't know if you guys get that.
I think she does have a lot of friends and allies, it's fair to say. And I would be very surprised if she was put in a position where she would lose the house. I would imagine, I'm just basing this on, what I've read myself, that if allies of Salmond would allow that to happen, I think he still has enough friends out there who would ensure that that scenario would not happen.
So I agree. That house has gone nowhere. Yeah, she'll stay. I should think that is clutching at straws. I agree.
I just think that kind of image off her. I don't know if Salmond's allies are trying to, play up to that. Poor Moira. I mean, it's terrible.
Of course,
she obviously lost her husband, but kind of almost made into a child, almost, or an infant, or someone who's completely helpless. I find that kind of side a bit uncomfortable. But the whole story, in some ways, quite. I found it immediately hard to believe that a guy who's got a First Minister's pension, an MP's pension, is died without a pot to pee in. But it's just, I think the whole thing is maybe a wee bit, and it's obviously designed to kind of curry a bit of sympathy for him, to curry sympathy for her. It maybe puts a bit of pressure on the SNP, the Scottish Government, or look what you've done to Alex, by kind of pursuing these claims, and then obviously he's had to go to court to clear his name. I think that's got a lot more to it than actually concerns that Moira's going to, lose the house.
It does illustrate how big a deal he remains in Scottish politics, more than a year after his sudden death.
And that will not go away. Do we think the story came from Salmond's allies? I mean, I'm not sure.
But not to get bogged down in the chewy details of that, because I'm sure we'll have time to kind of go over that in the future. So just to move on an unrelated note, Dougie, could you talk us through an article of yours that was grabbing some attention this week?
So we done a bit of crunching the numbers, the polling numbers for reform before and after John Swinney's anti-far right summit to see if it had any effect on support for reform, and it certainly had. Whether that's the effect that in fact, probably is the effect John Swinney hoped it would have on it, for very cynical reasons. But basically, in the 10 polls before his anti-far right summit, they were polling roughly about 13%. They're now polling there's been 10 polls since. They're now averaging around about over 17%. It's a rise of 35%. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but it just goes to show what a monumental waste of public money, waste of public time this meeting was. It's been over 6 months now. There's been no follow-up from it, as far as I'm aware. No. It was a single meeting where they talked a lot. But I think the key thing here is that John Swinney must have known it was going to have this sort of impact.
You're not suggesting a causal link between that summit and Farage's soaring in the polls.
Well, I'm not saying just the summit, but in general, John Swinney constantly. I mean, Reform don't really. They still don't have a presence here. They don't even have a press officer here in Scotland. So the only media they get is from John Swinney. John Swinney is the best advert that Reform have got. He's the only guy that he talks him up constantly. Not talks him up, but talks about the threat constantly. And it's him. It's these tactics that are highlighting that Reform are there.
I think
I think that's what Swinney wants. He wants that because he wants to split the.
Well, that's it. I disagree that there's a causal link. I don't think there is. I don't think you do either. But
usually there's a kind of symbolic moment here.
The base point is that in attacking Reform constantly, there's no doubt Swinney's trying to make the next election. He wants Reform to be the voice of the union in the next election, and he wants there to be a competition between two saltire-waving wings of nationalism. Now, although Reform are a unionist party, that wing of British nationalism, if you like, is wrapping itself in the saltire. And I think what Swinney and Farage are going to be doing is fighting out two different kinds of Scottish patriotism. One that presents itself as civic and lovely, and the other one that just hates foreigners and wants to send back asylum seekers. Those are two visions of Scottish nationalism in a way. And I know it seems odd to say that Reform they're not a Scottish nationalist party, clearly, but they are going to wrap themselves in the saltire, and they are going to articulate a different form of nationalism, because as we all know, nationalism can be anything to all men.
I think on that point, though, the strategy you mentioned, Mark, you need to bear in mind that there was a dry run of that in the Hamilton by-election, which came just weeks after this summit that we're talking about. So that summit was back in April. The Hamilton by-election, I believe, was in the first week of June. And there was much talk that it was a straight SNP Reform race. And obviously, Labour proved that to be a complete pile of rubbish.
That could well be what transpires in the next Holyrood election. There might be an absolute rejection by people of all forms of identity politics and of that kind, and people might actually vote on service delivery, your hospital, your schools, and that's Labour's big challenge, isn't it, to try and do that. But there's no doubt Swinney is trying to. He's competing nationalism.
I mean, he's the best publicist Reform I've got in Scotland, is John Swinney, and it's interesting to say about two competing from Scottish nationalism, because you know from the general election last year that an awful lot of Reform figures in Scotland are former Scottish nationalists as well, who obviously like that kind of blood and thunder.
There's always been a blood and soil wing to the SNP, always. And I've seen it myself as a young lad when I was on the fringes of all that stuff. There's definitely a blood and soil wing in the SNP. Always has been. So it's no surprise to me to see saltires, raised along the Calder Road in Edinburgh, not by yes voters, by people who just want to hate on foreigners. It's a dangerous game when you open that kind of worms.
I think this story struck a chord with me, Dougie, because I was one of the reporters that actually had to go along to this summit. I didn't sit through the whole thing. We were just invited into a Q&A.
Well, been a bit much.
But I'm just looking back at what I wrote up from the event. I think it was me that asked this question, but it was put to Swinney at the Q&A that would the summit have failed if Reform won 10 or more MSPs, which just reflects where Reform were in the polls, because in reality they could probably win more than double that. And Swinney said, the electorate will vote for who they choose. That's a matter of the electorate. For my part, I don't want to look back in a few years' time and think I didn't do anything. Well, he's certainly not done anything, because as you pointed out, he's been saying a lot about Reform.
But he's also not, I think even before the summit, and Smitty, you're right. I mean, I'm not saying because he held this summit,
it's not really done much to stop their eyes, has it?
It's more a kind of that symbolic moment.
Yeah,
10 before it, 10 after. But he's not. Normally there would be a follow up to something like this. We're now 6 months down the line, and there's been nothing. It
was definitely hinted at the time that there would. It wasn't the end of the process, I think is how they were putting it. I mean, we should also say that Reform were not invited to this event, although Thomas Kerr, the well-known councillor in Glasgow, said that he wouldn't have bothered going anyway. I think they had a demo outside, didn't they, at Queen Street Station?
I think I spoke to Professor James Mitchell at Edinburgh Uni for that story, and he made the point that Reform's biggest problem is going to be getting its vote out on the day, and it's going to be keeping that kind of, keeping himself in the headlines as we shift towards the NHS, public services and things like that. So I don't think Reform will get 20 odd seats. I think it'll roll back slightly in the coming months, because Reform, they don't really have much to offer other than that kind of blood and soil. But there's no doubt at all that they're going to be, I think, the second or third biggest party at Holyrood,
and their presence is going to be the story of the campaign.
And I think John Swinney will have played a part in that. I think he'll have played a part.
I think we've said in this podcast many times before, but how often Nigel Farage chooses to come up and campaign in Scotland during the kind of, particularly in April time at the heart of the campaign. But maybe if Reform think Wales is the real devolution campaign, maybe they'll take up a bit more of a back seat in Scotland. I don't know. But let's move on. Now, it won't be the first time we've talked about Rachel Reeves' looming budget, which is on not until November 26th, but I feel this budget has already been trailed for about the last 3 months. But the Chancellor took the unusual step on Monday of summoning journalists to Downing Street. I think it was 7:30 in the morning. They were told to turn up for a speech about 8:15 in the morning, in which Reeves basically stood up and said, I can't confirm anything yet, but then, proceeded to, well, this would be unfair to say she ripped up Labour's manifesto, but she certainly did not offer any commitments to the key plank of the manifesto of not raising income tax, not raising VAT, and not raising national insurance on employees. So just for context, if this does happen, if income tax, the basic rate does go up, she'll be, I believe, the first Chancellor to go back on a manifesto commitment on income tax since Dennis Healey in 1975. I don't know if you remember that, Smitty, yourself.
Oh, I remember it well. I was just getting my first pint at that point, I think. I was only 3.
But the point being, I'll just throw this out to you both. I mean, do you think voters will understand why, if indeed it does happen, why income tax has to go up?
Well, here's the thing. Okay, you against it. There's a very strong argument for putting income tax up, right? And there's a very good argument for imposing wealth taxes on the very wealthy, and there's a very good argument for trying to get our hands on the massive amount of wealth that's being created by all the tech companies who are running rampant throughout the world and making fortunes in the process. There are arguments to be made for getting some of that money into the public realm and trying somehow to make our public services and just the country feel richer. I mean, it feels like we're getting poorer. Now, that's because the money in our society is being sucked up by the super rich. Now, the state's got to try and get its hands on the money. There's a good argument for putting tax up, and there's a good argument for broadening the tax base beyond income to try and get more money.
Do you think the public understands these good arguments?
Well, here's the thing. Those arguments should have been made at the election by Labour. And Labour needs to have since the 2007 financial collapse, capitalism collapsed in 2007. Labour, since then, has been desperately scrambling to try and re-establish an order which had failed. Left-wing parties and left-of-centre parties need to provide an alternative view of the world and a proper alternative. And the lack of that alternative is why we see right-wing nutters like Farage entering the scene. Now, that argument should have been made at the election. The fact that it wasn't, and the fact that they're now going back on that, is monumentally catastrophic for Labour.
Because, I mean, I wonder if figures like, the Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are often accused of being Blairites, but I think Tony Blair and people like Gordon Brown must be looking at this and thinking we spent, a long, long time trying to move Labour away from the Tory attack of vote Labour for higher taxes. Because that was, throughout the years of Margaret Thatcher and John Major, the public were told over and over again, if you vote for Labour, you're voting for losing money. And, for New Labour also had many, many faults, but they resolutely tried to move away from that. And I do worry for Rachel Reeves, if she goes through that, it's inevitable she's going to go through this, but will she ever be able to shake that? Will the public be understanding? Maybe, if we turn some marvellous corner and the economy explodes, then, hey, it'll be brilliant. But
I think that's it. I actually agree with some of what you said, Smitty, especially the tech companies. You probably wiped out the deficit just with that. But the problem is she's going to end up hammering kind of middle earners. She's going to end up hammering people who are already having to tighten their belts. And there's this question that we're all in it together. We're not really. We don't all get paid 30 grand per episode of Planet Holyrood. Right. So right away, that's a problem. And that's what I mean about, the public won't understand. Because the public are like, well, hold on a minute, we've already had 15 years of...
Yeah. Do you think they'll be angrier, though, on, the fact they're paying more in tax, or will they view the ripping up the manifesto as a bit...
I think it's more in tax. I mean, obviously, I think the manifesto thing's for people who... I mean, there's probably a lot of people who voted for Labour in the election didn't even know that they promised not to raise income tax. They just wanted that change. I think I bang this drum and I say it every week, and I say it every week. Pound in the pocket. People will judge you on the pound in the pocket. And if Rachel Reeves is seen to be taking money out that kind of middle Britain, that's where you win in those. That's where you win in those elections. The side point to all this, and I feel with Express, I've got to bring up the kind of SNP side of it is, they've been all over the shop on this because you've got Shona Robinson telling journalists that oh no, she shouldn't raise income tax. An hour after John Swinney's spokesperson said, John Swinney's position hasn't changed since July, when he said that she should be raising income tax to bring parity. And they're just. I also wondered if Reeves might not do it if this was a kind of set out the worst case scenario, and then anything else you do doesn't seem so bad on the day. There's a bit of me like that. Is it going to get to it? It might not be quite as bad as the picture she painted.
She might pay on the basic rate, but then actually give back the national insurance, making people on balance a wee bit better off. But it won't take away for the attack she's going to get from the Mail, Express, the Telegraph for going back on a manifesto promise. I'm convinced there might have been other things she could have done other than that.
It's been argued that one of the things they're doing here is that they really want to drive down inflation. And I feel, if there was a drop in the cost of food, like, going to the supermarket, if people seen a reduction, maybe that would sort of dampen the anger a bit. But the risk is that if they go through tax rises and food inflation in particular and energy bills, there's rumours that they will cut some of the green levies and energy bills in an attempt to drag them down a bit. But if a year from now, food inflation's got up another 3-4%, I think
it's the food for me. I mean, I went shopping the other night just to buy some stuff for the weekend, really. And albeit I'll take it the money I spent on my mum's birthday gift, but and it was just for a kind of weekend's worth of food, it was 60 quid.
I know,
and I'm like, come on.
I always make the point. I think that's what really angers people. Yeah,
this is where people see it. They see it. They see it.
Whether they're going to the pub and getting a pint, which now costs £6.50, or whether they're buying a loaf of bread that's now £2.50.
But if Labour does succeed in bringing inflation down, there are other levers they could use, other than tax, which I don't think will actually have that much impact on inflation. But that won't. Even if your weekly shop at Lidl's a wee bit cheaper, that'll no make up for it.
They won't for Labour for that.
They won't thank Labour for it. They'll just say, well, that's an act of God, and Labour will still get pilloried for that manifesto breach, which is a bad look.
Just briefly to round things off, we should mention that one of the outcomes of Rachel Reeves raising income tax could be in Scotland, the Scottish Government's budget losing £1 billion. Now, we don't have enough time to go into the detail of exactly why that is, because we wrestled over this issue yesterday in the record office. I think after about
wrestling, I think you guys had been ahead at one point.
After about 6 hours, I think we grasped the principles of it. But basically, the SNP government will have a bit of a headache in that suddenly, income tax will be lower in some cases potentially than what people are paying elsewhere in the UK. So is it inevitable, Dougie, that the SNP will just have to raise income tax to match whatever Rachel Reeves does?
Well, this is what kind of alluded to earlier. You've got John Swinney back in July saying, Westminster should raise income tax. And then his spokesperson says yesterday, told David Walker, that's still John Swinney's position. An hour later, Shona Robinson's out saying, they can't raise income tax. The SNP are all over the place in this. And she's obviously, despite saying that they won't raise income tax. I mean, who wants to raise income tax 8 months, 7 months before an election?
I think that will be the main calculation in all of this. Will be
absolutely.
Well, if Shona Robinson and Swinney they will sit there and go, what impact will this have at the Holyrood election next April? And if they conclude it might look bad for the Nats, they won't give us stuff about the impact on public services or anything like that. They will say, right, let's just not do it and make ourselves look like the party that's putting money in your pocket.
And then we've got the inevitable tax hike a year later to look forward to. When you have to pay for that.
So Sean Robinson yesterday, one of the full quotes she said was, "I can't believe that a UK Labour government would actively take steps to cut Scotland's budget by around £1 billion. Now, that's obviously one interpretation of why Rachel Reeves has been forced into this measure, but it's just an example of, yes, everything in Scottish politics right now is through the prism of the election coming in May. Absolutely everything.
It brings us to Anas and how he
best
tries to get this thing, which is quite difficult for anyone to justify. How does Anas go to the voters? I know, by the way, obviously he's committed, I think, to trying to cut taxation in Scotland, but do better on service delivery. That might chime. But it's going to be difficult for him to get that message across because in people's minds, Labour are now a party.
The Scottish Labour commitment at the moment is they will not raise taxes if an ass, formed a government at Holyrood. He was asked last week about cutting income tax, and we didn't rule it out. You could tell there was now a hesitancy there to commit to that because, frankly, it's barring a miracle, no one really sees a scenario how that could happen. But it is a very, very big, square peg to fit in a round hole on this issue. I mean, and Ash yesterday was asked about this by me and other reporters, and he went back to the line about the mess that Labour have inherited from the Tories, UK-wide, and he also pointed out to the Scottish Government having £1 billion underspend and all these things. But as we've said in this podcast every single week, what will make any difference when it comes to May? Well, we'll find out soon enough. But I think for now, that's probably a good time to end. So thanks to my guests this week, Douglas Dickie and Mark Smith, for joining me. Thanks also to Daryl Devine from the Daily Record video team who produced this episode. I'm obliged to say you can listen again to all episodes of Planet Holyrood on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Watch it on the Daily Record YouTube channel. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast. And that's all for this week. So bye just now.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.